Totally excited today to have Shane Connolly on the Flower Podcast again. Welcome, Shane.
Thank you for asking me back. I
Oh my.
obviously behaved.
Well, your episode that we aired, gosh, I think it was back in season 2, was an extremely popular episode, especially because it was really one of the first episodes that we started to unpack in more depth the idea of sustainable floristry. And
Really? I didn't know
yeah,
that it was. I thought, oh gosh, well, that's a great honor then. Thank you.
yeah, oh, absolutely. So if we'll put links in our shows so that way people can go back and listen to that if you've missed it, because it's definitely worth the listen. And just for people who perhaps are unfamiliar with you, would you mind just briefly kind of telling us who you are?
Gosh, I am
I know
Shane Connolly.
it's hard to put that in a little nutshell. I know.
What do you say? I'm Shane Connolly. I've been doing flowers for over 30 years. My own business started in 1989. I worked for a company called Pulbrook and Gould before that. And I worked for someone called Michael Goulding before that. And yeah, it wasn't my life's ambition to do flowers, but it sort of happened when I was in my early 20s. And here I am in my late 20s still doing it. Who would have thought?
You know, you're so preserved. It's so perfect. I love that. Thank you. It gives me hope. It gives me hope. Truly.
Pilates.
Yes. I love that. So what's brought us back together again is last year, was it last year? Yeah, I think it was. Well, I don't know, with 2020, yeah, things are such a blur. Maybe it was fall of 2019. You did a lecture, and I think with Emily Thompson about Constance Spry. And
yes,
I don't remember when that was.
No, I don't either. But anyway, how wonderful.
I can't imagine that it was last year. So it must have been 2019.
Well, it could have been. We did something in New York together last year to raise funds for the exhibition that we're now talking about, the Constance Spry exhibition. So were you at that lunch in New York?
No, I couldn't.
But it wasn't recorded, so I don't know. We do speak about Constance. We're both great fans of Constance, so we do speak at the drop of a hat about her.
Well, I feel like there's a lot of people that maybe like they may hear that name, they may wonder about, and I just thought it would be an incredible episode just to kind of maybe step back and take a look at this life that has influenced so many people and so much of our industry.
True, absolutely true.
And so, first of all, I guess I want to say that, I was looking up and she was, and maybe this would be better for you because I feel like you know her more intimately.
There are 3 of us in this podcast.
That's right. There are indeed. But she lived from 1886 to 1960, which is an amazing span. And it's like that period of time in floristry to me is so, I don't know, to me, I feel like, I want to say there was like this awakening that happened over time, but at the same time, really not. It's just that we don't think of floristry in terms like we do now back then. And I don't know if that's just because of our own ignorance or because no one really dives into the history behind it.
There isn't a lot of history. I mean, there was a book written in the 1970s called The History of Flower, I think it might be called Flower Decoration, actually, by somebody called Beverly Nichols, who was a great friend of Constance Spry's, and he traces the history. I mean, what is floristry? Constance Spry hated the word floristry. She used the term floral decoration, and she was very adamant that she wasn't going to be called a florist. And in fact, she wasn't a florist. That was completely not part of her background at all. And I suppose before her, rich people had their gardeners who brought flowers in. There were flower shops, and they were the florists. And the flower shops you went to for your buttonhole, your boutonnieres, your corsages for parties, your funerals, to do wedding bouquets. And then what she brought in was a completely different approach to all of that. So she invented it, if you want. I really do think you could say that Constance Spry is the sort of midwife of what we think of as, well, floral design nowadays.
How interesting. Is that, why do you think that is, that you wouldn't want to be called a florist? Is that just because that's either too pedestrian, or is it that she doesn't really think of herself as being that influential? I mean, why is that?
Because I think it was probably two reasons. She was opening a shop. So in 1928, she opened a shop because she was starting to do work professionally in flowers. I mean, I could go into her history before that, which is even just as exciting, but she was 43 years old. So a career change at 43, wow, even nowadays would be quite a thing. But for a woman to do that in 1928, that was quite shocking in England, you know, where women either worked because they had to, or they were housewives. And certainly to work, well, she did have to actually, but, you know, it was a very interesting time. And she didn't want to be thought of as a florist shop because she didn't consider herself a florist. She employed 2 or 3 people to do that side of things, the wedding work and the funerals. But what she wanted to do was to bring a whole new approach to flowers for events, for parties. And just through a series of very lucky, I mean, I can tell you about them if you want, just very lucky things happened where her approach and her artistry, an innate artistry, got her noticed by the right people. And that artistry came from being a gardener. She says in one of her books, I am first and foremost and always will be a gardener. That was her. She didn't want to be a florist. She wanted to be a gardener who knew about flowers, who knew her product and brought it inside to show it off. So it wasn't it was a very different approach to flowers.
So would you consider her to be self-taught?
Yes, without question. She would have considered herself to be self-taught too. And there was a lot of trial and error, especially at the beginning, but I think it also produced some of her best work. You know, she found out how things worked. She found out that if you took leaves of certain things, they lasted longer, whereas most florists in flower shops wouldn't have even used those things. She brought vegetables in, which florists would never have had then. She used more unusual flowers. I mean, there was a real sense, not that I was around then, there was a real sense, contrary to rumor, that florists were very safe with flowers. And I think there is that danger in some areas of floristry nowadays. You know they can get Colombian roses in any color they want. So they'll use Colombian roses with a bit of fern and it'll be safe. Whereas Constance Spry would have abhorred that approach. She would have been trying to find the thing that suited you, Scott, best of all for your party, and the thing that really represented the season and was unusual and people would never have seen in their lives before. That was what made her different.
It's so fascinating to me as I hear you describe this, because I think how many businesses do that exact thing today. And you think back in 1928, I mean, there's a ton of people who don't do that, but there are a lot that do. And that's that wedding and event industry where they're trying to be personalized, or they forage the garden or property or what have you, just to bring in that element of nature into this controlled environment, just to make a difference. But in 1928, you think there was no internet, there weren't books really about that either, and at least I assume not. Really. And then
there were a few. Interestingly, there were a few. Gertrude Jekyll had written a book about flowers, and Gertrude Jekyll again was a gardener, so she had written a book about flowers and which were the good flowers to grow to use in the house. But it was very much your garden into your house. So if you were poor, you didn't really have access to that. And Constance Spry very much, I mean, one of her books is the subtitle is A Millionaire for a Penny. And she wanted flowers to be available to anyone so that people could, she believed beauty was really important and that beauty uplifted people, and especially natural beauty. So she felt that, you know, she had taught in the East End of London. She had taught in the squalor of Ireland in the early parts of the 20th century, and she saw poverty, And she knew that if people got a little bunch of flowers, that changed their day and that elevated life. So she did know what flower, you know, she knew. It's funny, I always think that so many florists forget why we have flowers in the first place. You know, the whole ethos behind giving somebody a bunch of flowers. Why don't you give them a roast chicken? Because it isn't roast chicken they need, it's sustain, unless they're a vegan or a vegetarian. But the flowers, it's a different level completely, isn't it? And if you give, even if I'm given some flowers, I mean, there's something incredibly personal about being given some flowers. It's like there's no other gift like that. And she knew that. And she knew that it didn't have to be vast sums of money. It could also be something as simple as a bunch of violets that was given. And she, you know, she didn't put a price on flowers. And I think that's something, again, which we can really learn. I mean, she didn't make a lot of money in her first years. She in fact was losing money until Shav Spry, who was her partner for all of her life, until he got involved with the business and he saw these losses. You know, one place she was spending more than she was charging to do their flowers every week.
Wow.
Because she didn't, it was all about the beauty of nature coming inside. So, you know, that was her extraordinary gift. I think that she recognized that, she knew what that was.
Well, and it's interesting because you think almost 100 years later, and these are still the struggles florists have, where they don't charge enough for what they do,
absolutely,
for whatever that reason might be. But I think that's fascinating to me how, you know, somebody that, I don't know, I think back to what you just said about the chicken versus the flowers and why not do that. And you just think, because it's almost like flowers were a luxury. And so, which they were perceived that way, but yet I would imagine, you know, in the English, you know, countryside or in other places that was also very much a part of your culture, to have have flower gardens, or to have, you know, if you're growing vegetables, you're going to have a few flowers.
Exactly.
And why not bring that indoors or gift that to someone? That's really fascinating. I know that you, probably in the interest of time, maybe skipped over it, but I would love to hear the story of how she, you know, stumbled into her success. Like you said, there was a couple things that happened. I'm curious what one of them might have been that kind of got her to the place where she was.
Basically, she had a very unsuccessful, unhappy marriage in Ireland, where her father had moved because of work. She moved back to England with her child and had to work. And she worked, first of all, it was during the First World War. She worked in a munitions factory as a supervisor. Wow. Then she worked and met a man called Shav Spry. And he was married, she was married. She divorced her husband. He couldn't divorce his wife, so they never actually married. She changed her name to Spry to live with him. And for the rest of her life, she lived with Spry. And he brought her into a sort of more comfortable place because she didn't have to work quite so hard. They had a nicer house. She could get back to her first love, which was gardening. And she could grow things, and brought them into the house. And she became very well known for being a lovely person to go for dinner to, because she was a brilliant cook. She absolutely understood about vegetables and how important they were in food. In England, at a time when people ate, you know, beef followed by pork followed by chicken, she knew about vegetables and how to cook them. And people loved coming to visit her. And a theatre designer called Sidney Bernstein visited her, and he saw the flowers which she did in her house, and he said, I want you to do the flowers for this shop which I've just designed. And it was called Atkinson's, a scent shop. And he had designed it with antique mirror all lining the walls. And he wanted urns of beautiful flowers, like no florist shop did, in this shop that reflected the scent of the perfumes. And she said, yes, okay, I'll do that. And at that time, she was teaching a few days a week in a girls' continuation school in the East End of London. And she thought, well, I could do that on my free days. And of course, like all these things, as we flower people know, there are no free days left suddenly. And she had never done it before. And so she went, she went and he showed her these incredible antique urns that he had bought. And she thought, what am I going to do? And it was November, the worst time of year for flowers.
Oh my goodness.
Exactly. But she watched, or October, November, she was back in her house in the country. She saw somebody going past and they just cut down some old man's beard. Do you know that wild clematis?
Oh yes, I love
which gets
that.
the fluffy seed pods.
Yes.
And she thought, if I had some of that, and then she saw some brambles, and she put brambles, which brambles, wild
Right.
brambles, old man's beard, autumn foliages, and she went to Covent Garden Market and bought some orchids and put those all together in these urns. And so unusual and so extraordinary that the police had to control the crowds outside the shop looking at these flowers. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. And that's a fact. That actually happened. And after that, everyone who was anyone started to want Constance Spry to do the flowers. So for a while, she was a one-woman band. And then she realized she had to have a premises in London because she was traveling by train with armfuls of flowers every day. And she took a lease on a small shop and employed one or two people, a van driver. And I mean, it was it was like all of us at the beginning of our careers, where everything was just happening by chance. This boy came to them and said he wanted a job and said, can you drive? And he said, well, no, I can't. So she put him in the van and got him to drive round and round Vincent Square until he hit a lamppost. And then she said, well, I think you can drive now. So he was their driver. It was that sort of incredible, just by the skin of your pants, by the seat of your pants. Is that it? The skin of your teeth, seat of your pants.
Yeah,
it was just about happening. But the result was, as you know, like all of these things, sometimes your best, most creative thing happens when you're actually failing and you're flying around and you think that'll work. And suddenly there's something, you don't have enough time to get too designery about it. And your gut instinct tells you that's better. I'm going to use that. And that's what was happening a lot in those days with her shop. And then she got, some of the royal family noticed her work. The King George and Queen Mary were the king and queen, and they had 4 sons. And one of the sons saw her work and thought that's amazing and asked her to start doing flowers in his house every week. And then the Prince of Wales, who was the sort of the complete pin-up boy of the nation, he saw her work. Then he met an American, Wallace Simpson. And so in 1937, which is less than 10 years after she opened her business, she was asked to do the flowers for their wedding in France. And that made her a celebrity overnight, practically. And she was invited to America to give talks and demonstrations. Then she opened a shop in New York in 1939. And so Constance Spry Inc. became the American side of Constance Spry. That wasn't a huge success because the war came and she couldn't go over to actually supervise it herself. And again, another interesting lesson for all of us flower people. Sometimes you have to stand back. You have to not be up the ladder, I always say. You have to not be up the ladder because you won't see what's happening at the bottom. So you have to sometimes let somebody else go up the ladder. And I think she learned that the hard way, as we all do. And she slightly was losing control. By about 19, before the war, she was employing 70 people. And, wow. That's a scale of flower business that I don't even know. That amazingly big florist in Boston, I mean, would he have 70 people? I don't think so. That's massive amount. Massive.
And especially back then.
Back then. But it shows how quickly she had revolutionized it all. And then, of course, she opened her school, and then she opened another school, and then she bought Wingfield Place after the war, and, again, was teaching all the time, lecturing all the time, still gardening, still just extraordinarily busy. So,
Shane, hold on one second.
I answered your question in a very long way there.
Oh, no. That was wonderful. I need to kind of give the internet a second to adjust a little bit. I've got some lagging going on. I don't know if it's on your end or my end. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly, but we sometimes do have not consistent Wi-Fi here.
Okay, you're good. Well, let's just give it a second because maybe it'll catch up here.
Okay.
When I just cleared my throat, did you hear any feedback on your end?
A bit echoey.
Okay. Let's see here. Do you have any apps open on your computer? Are you on your computer or phone?
I'm on my computer.
Okay.
I've got what could I close? I could close mail.
Yes. Yeah, sometimes that
Would that
might
be good.
Yeah, sometimes that drains the bandwidth a little bit. I'm looking on mine as well to see if there's anything I can close.
Okay. Quit mail. Right, is that any better?
We'll give it just a second. No, that was really good. I'm so excited about this episode all of a sudden. I was before, but now I'm even more so now that I'm learning these things.
I don't have anything else. I don't have anything else open.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, then I think we'll just keep pushing forward.
Okay.
The sound is good. It's just sometimes the audio is lagging versus the video, which doesn't matter to me. I don't care. I just want to make sure that on your end you're not having any issues. So
you are slightly freezing sometimes. Your face doesn't match, your words don't match your face, but that's fine.
Okay. That might not be a bad thing. So let me make sure. Let me ask this question. Is your phone on your Wi-Fi? Because I just noticed mine was.
It is.
Maybe
I will take it off.
Yeah, maybe that would help. All these little things that actually my sons teach me because they're like, Dad, you have too many things open. You have.
I never know what I'm doing. There we go. That's off as well.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll push forward. Where to go from here? The thing I love about that story is all of a sudden it's like, I don't know. I think back and I think, why was that such an amazing draw that people just were lining up out a window to see these amazing florals? Because I think of the idea of bringing nature inside. Okay, I'm going to pause another second here because. Yep. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay. I'm still okay. We'll try again. One of the things I love about that story is, for us, I feel like I hate to say we're used to, because I don't think that's true, but we see, especially on social media, so much design work where nature is being brought into our indoor environment. And so the idea that police were required to monitor the flow of traffic outside of a shop window is fascinating to me, because I think, why was that so amazing? And I guess it was just so different. That is
well, I think it was the middle of a city. It is crazy. And I think also, this was post, not, I know it's 10 years after the First World War ended, but people were probably hungry for beauty, art. I mean, it was a very great time for the arts in general in the 1920s and the 1930s. People were hungry for beauty, for good experiences, and there was a lot of money around as well. So, you know, again, very rich people were looking for a way to spend their money, and suddenly they see something like this and think, whoa, this is a new way.
Sure.
Yeah, it is amazing. I agree. It is amazing. It is true. That's the extraordinary thing. You know, she did cause a bit of a sensation, and she was quite a shy person. So I think it must have been a bit of a shock to her to find that she was a bit of an overnight sensation.
Oh my goodness. Knowing that she was shy, I can't even imagine how stressful that became so quickly then.
Yeah, yeah. And I think also she did say that when people would, in those days, there was no social media. Nobody knew what anybody looked like or what
Right.
the work looked like, as we remember, you and me, before social media. I mean, people would say, if somebody had said, Scott, I would have thought, I don't know what he looks like, I don't know what age he is. We knew nothing. And she quite enjoyed that when people booked her to come and talk about their daughter's wedding, they looked a bit disappointed because she didn't look, I mean, Constance Spry was very short. She was quite plump. Someone described her as bird-like. You know, she had quite a beaky feature. And she wasn't tall, slim, artistic looking. You know, she didn't waft around. She walked like a little bird. And I think she quite enjoyed the surprise on people's faces when she went to talk to them.
That's amazing.
It wasn't what they were expecting.
That's amazing.
So she was quite a contradiction in terms in many ways.
So from that point, when she started the shop here in New York, I mean, it wasn't long after that. I mean, World War II was already happening, but the U.S. wasn't into that at that point.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, and the shop started because she had a great band of very wealthy American supporters, and they basically financed the whole thing. And if truth be told, her heart probably wasn't completely in it because she hated traveling. So she hated the idea of going across by boat to America. Yeah. And she had done it 3 or 4 times. And she did not want, when the war came, it was almost like a blessed relief that she could say, I can't go again. You know, I can't go, yeah. It's too dangerous. But what was sad was that the people who had been left there, they, you know, it's so hard to interpret what somebody else wants. And in those days, they didn't have social media. They couldn't send, when I'm in America giving talks, my team can send me photographs, which I get that second. And I can respond and say, I think that's too pink. Scott would prefer a bit more white, you know, and it's all done. Whereas she, of course, when she was away, her business in England suffered. And when she was not in America, the business there suffered. So I think it was a very difficult period. And then the war didn't help. It helped put a nail in the coffin, but that's about it.
Oh my goodness. Well, and that's so fascinating because you just think about having multiple locations, especially on both sides of the Atlantic, and how different. I mean, you're right. Like, how many days would it take to travel from England to New York City? I mean, I can't imagine. I mean,
at least 5-7 days.
Yeah, it probably depends on the boat you're on too. So, and if there are very many stops in between. So, yeah, which there aren't a lot. But anyway, that's amazing. And so then so after the war, of course, we had the Depression that was huge. It was global. Yeah. You know, I feel like that had to impact all kinds of businesses. How did
Spry? Yeah. She obviously had some sort of innate canniness. Do you have that word, canny, in America?
Yeah, we do.
You know, that sort of, and she, during the war, she realized that actually her great love was teaching. She had always, that's what she did before she started doing flowers. She taught in a girls' school. She taught how to look after. She was basically a health lecturer in Ireland. So she really liked teaching, and her father was a great teacher. So she decided she needed to buy somewhere where she could put all these skills together. And after the war, literally as the war was ending, she saw in a Sunday magazine this house for sale near Windsor in England called Winkfield Place, big Georgian mansion of a place. And she decided that that's what she needed to do. So she bought it, and it had been an orthopedic hospital for officers during the war. So it was in a terrible state, terrible. And she got it at a knockdown price. And I spoke with one of the women who were in the first intake of students. So she went in the 1946 term for a year to study with Constance Spry. And she said it was extraordinary. There were hooks hanging from the ceiling, where officers' arms used to be hung from to help heal the bones. And basically she got her students, she was teaching them homemaking skills. So cooking, gardening, vegetable gardening, painting, decorating, dressmaking, curtain making, fine art, painting. She got all her friends who were great artists, great cooks, she got them to come and do the teaching. And basically she got the house decorated by the girls, because she'd say, now we're going to do this room. And she would teach them the skills of making curtains, surprise, surprise. The one woman I spoke with, Spry had noticed that she painted quite nicely. Now, Constance Spry couldn't paint to save her life. She couldn't draw. She always said, that was not in her skill set. This girl could. And Spry noticed that, and she said, well, I think I would love to have murals in this room. And she basically said to her, I would like murals on all the walls, and I would like them to look like a eucalyptus tree. And the girl didn't even know. She said to me, I didn't know what a eucalyptus tree even looked like, but Spry said to her, if you go talk to the gardener, he'll show you one. So she went out, and the gardener said, that's a eucalyptus tree. And she did murals over the whole walls of eucalyptus trees, which she had never done. And she said the most extraordinary thing was, because Mrs. Spry said, would you do that? You felt empowered, and you felt like you were able to do it. And I think that was one of her gifts. She did empower people, and she did say to them, nonsense, she never asked them to do the things they did normally do. And there's a lovely story to when I'm really leaping ahead. Is that bad? I'm jumping all over the place.
I'm loving it. So go ahead.
You're not getting a word in edgeways.
I love it.
As you probably know, she was asked to design the flowers for the Queen's coronation in 1953. So that was sort of the highlight of her career, if you like. And she was basically the artistic director of the whole coronation. So, she was the one who advised on the planting schemes for the route. She came up with the idea that flowers could be given as gifts from the whole of the Commonwealth to decorate the route with. And a few months before the coronation, at one of the meetings, they had just realized that all the royals and the visiting royals all went to Buckingham Palace for lunch after the coronation. There were a huge pile of people. What were they going to do with them? They had to entertain them, but they weren't royal, so they weren't going to the palace. And they started to look at places where they could have a lunch, basically. And everything was booked up because, of course, everything had been booked because of the coronation.
Of course.
And so she said, find me a venue and we'll do it. We'll do it with the students. And they found a venue next door, which was a hall of a school that had been bombed in the war. So it was, desolate. She came up with a scheme to decorate that. She borrowed tapestries from an embassy. She borrowed urns from the Duke of Wellington. She borrowed this, she borrowed that. She made tablecloths, she being her students, tablecloths out of cheap dress fabric so that it looked, more interesting, more colorful. And with her business partner, Rosemary Hume, they invented coronation chicken, which of course, I don't know if have you ever had coronation chicken in America?
I don't think so, but I don't know. I guess
well, it's still around. You still get it in England. I have to tell you, if you visit England, even if you go into a sandwich shop, quite often that'll be one of the fillings for the sandwich, coronation chicken. And it's basically chicken in a very lightly curried sauce with apricots and toasted nuts as well. So it's a very tasty, but cleverly, it also, there were no cookers. There were no fridges. They had to have something that could be slopped into buckets and brought to the place and put on the nice plates for the guests. And she did all that with the help of her friends. And there's a story told that one of her friends, she said, I need someone to be the manageress of all the waitresses. And she said, I've never done that in my life. She said, but don't be silly. You've always eaten at good restaurants. You know exactly what to do. And that was always her reasoning. So this friend ended up being the manageress for the day of this whole thing, who had never done it in her life. But she was right. She had eaten in good restaurants. So she knew what level of service people would require. So she could see, you know, she was empowered by Constance. So she would say, that person doesn't have enough water. That, you know, she was able to make the whole thing a triumph, which it was.
Wow. What?
And she, at that stage, she would have been 64, 60 more, 66, 86 to 63. 86 to 53 is 63. So she wasn't, you know, no spring chicken. And she did all that.
What an amazing gift. I mean, first of all, you think about, I mean, I'm just looking back at our conversation here and I'm like, first of all, you've got someone who, the idea of bringing the outdoors in just sort of like was this awakening. You know, we had the golden era, we have the industrial era. We need to have some trips like this for flowers, I think.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so it's like you have that, and then you have her creating sort of this following because of her style, and celebrities noticing her, whether they're royalty or other people of influence, and then you just think, you know, this visionary, this person who she would never probably call herself a visionary.
Never.
Because to her it was just natural. It was just a natural thing. But then to be able to see a little glimmer of a gift or a little attribute of this person, and to empower them to like go paint a mural, to go manage an entire, you know, gigantic meal for this big group of people. You know, I don't know. I love that. I love that so much.
It didn't always win her friends. I mean, she had a lot of good friends, don't get me wrong, but I think a lot of people thought she was quite scheming. And, you know, a lot of people thought that was all being done. You know, was the ladies that went to Winkfield, who I spoke with, you know, their parents were paying £100 a term, which in 1940s and early 50s, that was a huge amount of money. So for £300, I don't know what the equivalent is nowadays, probably $20,000, something like that, $30,000. Wow. I mean, you know, not insubstantial amount. Their daughters were basically making a garden for Constance, painting all the rooms, making the curtains, making everything. And they loved every minute. They said it was the best times of their lives.
Well, you just think for parents who can afford something like that, this may have been some of the first time these young ladies or people that were enrolled actually worked, you know.
Yes, it was.
You know, because they either had servants or they had, you know, staff at home. And it's like, what a empowering thing, because you've gone from being told what you can and can't do to like anything's possible. It kind of makes me think of Willy Wonka almost, you know, where, you know, you just have all these ideas, and I don't know, I'm really fascinated by this. I think it'd be interesting to find someone, a person or two that's actually was, you know, if I would think there's still a handful of people that have been through that process.
Oh yes, no, I've spoken with a few. I've spoken with several ladies who were Spry girls. You know, they were there, and now they're in the late 80s, early 90s. But for them, it was the most extraordinary time in their lives. They had, not all of them, but most of them had come from houses where servants did everything. So they were in their generation, that wasn't going to happen. There weren't going to be servants anymore after the Second World War, not on that level. So Spry could see that. She could see there was a need for these women basically to be taught, it sounds sexist nowadays, but to be taught how to run a house. And it is sexist in a lot of ways, but had they not been empowered to do that, they would have been floundering and feeling inadequate and feeling disempowered and feeling disenchanted with the whole lot. She was giving them a power. And at the same time, her schools in London, so there was Wingfield and there were 2 other schools. So if you couldn't afford to go to Wingfield, you could go to one of the other schools. So it wasn't just an elitist thing. There were other routes to it. And, you know, she trained huge numbers of florists.
That's just, it's so crazy to me. How do you think she has impacted your style?
Well, I was very lucky. When I first started being involved in flowers, my whole thing I enjoyed was gardening. And I met a man called Michael Goulding and his business partner, who's still alive, called Elizabeth Barker. And they had both trained at Pulbrook at Constance Spry. So they were Constance Spry products, as it were. And when they had a business where they did only events. So when I said, I love this, they let me help them carrying buckets and such like. And they used loads of things from their own garden. They had growers who grew things in their gardens. Then they, when I said I wanted to do this, I thought I was very good, as you do. They said, we wouldn't take you on because we don't have enough work. We suggest you go and work at Pulbrook and Gould. And Pulbrook and Gould, again, is like the granddaughter of Constance Spry. And Rosamond Gould, who started it, was one of Constance Spry's head decorators. So she knew Constance Spry really well. And I had this extraordinary experience. I spoke with her on the telephone about last November. She's now 97.
Oh my goodness.
And she's not completely clear of mind in most things. But when you talk about the flowers, she used to help do the flowers in Atkinson's, the scent shop, all those years ago. She used to help every week do those flowers. You know, it's quite extraordinary the difference they made to she made to people's lives. So I was lucky in a way. I was trained by Constance Spry products. So to say how did she influence me? Hugely, I would say. And also, I feel quite. That's why I'm so passionate about her, and why I'm so glad to be curating this exhibition. I feel that we're a similar product. We both accidentally do flowers. The gardens, even though we weren't gardeners, as in we weren't paid to garden, gardening is where it all comes from. And just that observation of flowers in their natural state and thinking, how could I make that look nice? I mean, Constance Spry did dead flowers. She did vegetables. She did fruit. And she just didn't see anything as off limits. And I think that's the joy of real flower design, that nothing is off limits. And sometimes that's a bad thing when you see what some people drag through the front door to put in their designs. But she just had that coupled with innate good taste, I suppose. She didn't like the word good taste. She didn't like the implications that there was good taste and bad taste. But there was no question, well, you know, there's different taste.
There you go.
You say, that's politer, isn't it?
Yes. Well, you know, it's interesting because I was just thinking as you were describing that that scene in my head, I'm thinking, you know, it's all these images I've seen of her or her work. They're all black and white.
I know.
And it's like, oh my gosh. I know I just got done last night watching your video that you produced for the Cathedral Antique Show. And I think about the colors and the branches you used and the amaryllis you used, and you just think about that color and the way it all worked together so wonderfully. And then I think back to her photographs, and you could really see the artistry in what she did. But it's so two-dimensional in a way because you don't have the color. You don't get to see the brilliance in that particular part of her design.
And the photographs were all used specifically for the book. So when she wrote a book, the photographs were taken specially for that book in a studio type setting. There are very few photographs in her books which are in a house or in a venue. amazingly, because of the exhibition, her archive is kept at the Royal Horticultural Society. They were given it by her estate in 3 stages, and we were allowed to look through that archive. And there are some photographs of things that she did for parties, and they're absolutely extraordinary. You know, the ingenuity, the dare. There's one where the walls of a room are completely covered with boxwood, painted blue. I mean, what? I know, but it's in black and white. You can't see it's in blue.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's what it says on the back. Covered in boxwood, painted blue. Just extraordinary to even think about doing, you know, to have seen that in color. It mightn't have been quite so amazing. Maybe the black and white, you know, times change, tastes change. I certainly look at my own early books, and styling of photographs changes so much. And, you know, my first book was in the middle 90s. And in those days, stylists added plates and glasses and cups and knives and forks. And it was very busy, and it does produce a different look. And I think that's the problem with some of her books. But if you read the words have not dated at all. The words are the extraordinary bit. You know, the sense that she talks. I go to her books all the time. If I'm trying to think, what could I do? Scott wants mixed red flowers for his 30th birthday party. What could I do? And Constance Spry will give you the right thing. She'll say, if you want it to look really red, add a touch of orange. If you want it to look very subtly red, add pink. You know, and you sort of think, God, that's right. That's absolutely right. What could be more boring than a big pile of red roses, but add some orangey colored foliage in that? It comes to life. It just suddenly is a completely different thing. And add different shades of pink, and it suddenly is like heart-meltingly pretty.
Wow.
She does. I just couldn't recommend more highly that people read her books. They really do.
Well, maybe I'll have to get you to send me a list of your favorites, and we'll make sure to publish that.
All of them.
Okay, there you go. That makes it easy.
I will send you a list, including that one that I held up. I was thinking, in 1942, during the war, she wrote this book, and it's called Come Into the Garden, Cook. And it was a cookery book where she wrote about how to grow your own vegetables. The nutrition of vegetables was unheard of. No one understood the need to eat vegetables, certainly in England. Maybe in America they did. She describes how to grow them, how to cook them, how to make salads.
Really?
Yeah, incredible. In 1942. So, you know, Martha Stewart is perhaps what Constance Spry was without all the social media.
Wow.
And you know that Martha Stewart will tell you how to make a new cardigan, and she'll also tell you how to grow things. She'll tell you how to cook things. That's exactly, and she would acknowledge that. She would acknowledge that Constance Spry was a huge influence on her.
Okay, so you said this a minute ago, and for people who are involved in floral design, which I have been indirectly, but not to the level that so many people are, but the idea of adding these other off shades of color to help either intensify the colors you're working with, like the little bit of, you know, off orange for the red or pink with, I mean, I'm like, I've never heard that before.
Oh, and really?
I have, but it's so funny because now that I've seen seen some of your work, or I've seen other people's, I'm like, okay, now that makes so much sense to me.
Yeah.
And that's just one of those things that I guess because I've never been formally trained in design, I maybe that's something they teach. I don't know. I just, that was new to me. So
I just think it's also, again, her great thing was to be open to experiences, to look at art, to look at, I mean, I'm always saying that when I teach any people, I always say technique is nothing. Inspiration is what you need. And, you know, anyone can teach someone how to do an arrangement of flowers, and you can guarantee it'll be as boring as the next person's unless they add inspiration of their own. And they might have a favorite art gallery that they go to, and they'll see paintings, or a garden, or, I mean, there's so many places that people can get inspiration. Lots of people get inspiration from fashion. And it's just looking and thinking, wow, I love how that pink silk falls. And then when you look at it in a painting, you see that there's an awful lot of white in that pink actually, and the artist has used a lot of white paint.
Sure.
And that maybe he's put it in pale green setting, and then you think, gosh, if I used a pale green bowl and filled it with the softest pink roses with just a touch of white, I could not even slightly approach the incredibleness of that painting, but you know, that would give me the effect. And it's that's what Constance Spry did. I mean, she was an incredible collector of beautiful furniture, of art. She loved beautiful things, and she didn't want them for their value. She wanted them for what message they gave her.
Mm.
And I think that's something that I would love floristry, sustainability and inspirationability. They're the two things I would love floristry to be more concerned with.
Mm. I think that's really great. I think, I just think back to what an exciting time for you to follow in the footsteps of direct trainees of her, and then for you to kind of evolve on your own and how you do what you do. I know I brought this up a little before we started recording, that I'm curious, how has your aesthetic or your design style changed over the years? How have you taken what maybe you learned from that time and now you've made it your own? And so how has that evolved? Because styles change, fashion changes. I'm just
yes.
curious.
I mean, your own style changes and also fashions change, and you have to adapt to it. I would say when I started up my business, I suppose.
So Shane, hold on one second. Did you just touch your laptop?
No.
Okay. Well, it's like your hand just went across something that picked up on the mic, so I couldn't hear what you said. So just to make you aware, I apologize. It just happened, so that's why I was like, okay. No. Now you were saying
how my style has evolved.
Yes.
So I suppose when you start up your own business, in my experience, there are two things. The first thing is that you want to please people.
Sure.
And therefore, you might not necessarily have the confidence to fight your corner. You know, they might say, this is what I want, and this is a photograph of what I want. You think, that's horrible, but you still want to please them. You say, of course, yes. How many would you like? I think there is very much that element of confidence. And I think also your head is full of so many different ideas. You want to do them all. So it's a bit like a cook who puts every spice and every flavoring. And then you start to realize that it's actually editing out things that makes you better.
Yes.
And I think also the more you do things, the sad or happy for me, but sad fact is that the better known you become, the more people think that you must be right anyway. So, I could sort of say, I'm using a ruler. Isn't this beautiful? And I do think there might be one or two people who would say, that's so clever. I'm not going to do that.
just because you said it, right?
Well, there is that very bad. That is it is a fact. I don't go with it, but there is also the fact that you get more confident and you can say, do you know what? I mean, I absolutely love foliage. I absolutely love growing plants, and I love foliage. And I suppose there was a stage in my early part in the 90s when things were very flowery, huge amounts of flowers, which I didn't like, but I did a lot of very flowery things. And I think very flowery can be beautiful if it's the right flowers, but sometimes, like at this time of year, very flowery can look very awful. Because in England, certainly, the things that are around are all imports. They're not looking great. I mean, very flowery in the middle of June with peonies and garden roses and delphiniums, that's glorious. But I think I've got more confidence. So my style perhaps is more confident. And I think confidence can be a good thing and a bad thing, but I think I would say it hasn't changed that much. I still love the same things. I'm still drawn to things that don't look like they came from a florist shop. So that rules out a lot of imported stuff for me, and things that don't look like you could say what price they were. So my real dislike is imported roses, with the big long stem and the little head at the top. I can't be doing with those at all, because to me, they just scream of what cost is rather than what beauty is. Sorry, saying
that's
that
interesting. No, that's interesting.
An importer. Whereas give me something that could have come out of a vegetable patch, or could have come out of somebody's garden, and nobody knows what price that is. So they look at the flowers. They don't look at thinking, well, they've spent a fortune on this wedding. And I like that feeling. I like that feeling very much.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because it takes a degree of pressure off a design perhaps that you do in January versus June, because in January you might expect it to be more stark. I mean, downstairs we've got this beautiful vase of quince, and and it's just it sat bare for about 10 days, and then now it's exploding with blooms. And I think to myself, what would I add to that to make that more sellable, or more of a retail type situation, or more expected, maybe is the right word.
I know, that's exactly the right word, more expected.
And I think I look back and I'm like, but for this time of year, it's exactly perfect.
Exactly right.
Yeah, it doesn't need to have foliage everywhere. It doesn't need to have other flowers taking away. It's just, and then it allows you to truly, really see and grasp those little peachy coral kind of blooms that are opening up.
And it's back to, as Spry was doing back then, it's bringing the season inside. You look at that, you think of this time of year. If you had a big vase, if you put delphiniums in with that and peonies, you see flowers. You don't see winter. You don't see spring. You don't see anything. You just see flowers. And that's where I get so frustrated. It's very interesting when you said that expected, that word expected. And I think too many flower designers just worry about what is expected, and their only inspiration comes from other flower designers on Instagram. And everybody then ends up doing the same thing. It's like, McDonald's food, it's the same whatever country you go to. You know what the coffee tastes like. You know what the chicken tastes like. You know what everything tastes like. And that to me isn't a design experience. That is just a sort of fundamental thing. Then it's completely serviceable rather than beautiful.
And you think back to Constance doing that grand opening of that store. And you think about what she did at that particular time. And I mean, I wish I could see a photograph of that.
So do I.
You just think there's probably wasn't one. And
no, there weren't.
Yeah. And you just think, wow, that is so. I think what made that so fascinating to me is obviously it was unexpected, but yet it resonated with people.
Well, we don't know. History doesn't tell us. Many of the people might have been standing there saying, I've never seen anything so disgusting in my life.
True.
Come and look at this, calling the whole crowd, look at that rubbish.
It's rubbish, yeah. Somebody put compost in a vase.
I know. Well, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So maybe there was an element of that as well. But
sure.
If
that's funny.
If every flower designer could get people to react, wouldn't that be a great achievement?
Yeah, just to have the emotion, just to cause reaction. And
absolutely.
My wife and I have this conversation a lot where we're looking through social media or people send us images, and then we comment, how often these images look so similar.
Yeah.
I think only because I know the people and I know some of their nuance, that I often can say, okay, well, I can tell this person did this one or this person did that one. But to the average person, you might not be able to tell. And what a privilege to be able to do work that's recognizable as distinctly you.
Absolutely. I think that's essential. If you want to use the word artist, floral artist, if you want to say, and that's, I think, what Constance was saying with floral decoration rather than a florist. She was saying, no, I want to be different. I want to be unique, not in a big-headed way, but I want, why else am I doing it? If florists want to use the word floral designer, floral artist, they need to behave like a designer or an artist. And they need to be doing things that are different from everybody else. Can you imagine an artist who painting somebody else's work? They would be sued.
That's right. No, that's true.
Whereas you're quite right, especially because of social media, which is a blessing and a curse. You can look through it and you think, I've seen that before, and oh yes, that's what they did 2 days ago, and it's just the same. It's the same. And how lovely when you see a beautiful vase of quince like you've got downstairs, and you think, oh, isn't that lovely? Such a relief, nearly.
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting you say that, because that's exactly what I was thinking last night when I was looking at that, because I thought, oh, I should do this or I should do that. And I'm like, no, it is a relief. It's like, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like editing things or allowing things to be in their natural state. I know I told you earlier, I was watching and I mentioned it earlier, the video from the cathedral that you did.
Oh yeah.
And you designed these 3 mantles, and in each of them, they were distinctly different, based on either a change in artwork or a change in whatever style you wanted to approach it from. And yet they were each so natural. They were each so lovely, whether you incorporate more, well, it's what it is. And it's very, whether it's minimal with these amazing nerines and just the right amount of color, or adding, tomatoes into the design. But then at that last design with the crab apples, and I just think the color and the way that tied in with everything. And I know if you haven't seen it, I apologize, because I'm teasing now. But it's a side of design that I think I appreciate about you specifically, is you look at nature or the garden or what you pass on the road every day, perhaps, and you see potential in it. You don't necessarily allow yourself to have, to be dictated to.
No.
And I think that's fascinating, and that makes me think back to when you're planning an event. I'm going to change course here a little bit. If you're planning an event or a design or some sort of feature, how do you begin that process, especially if it's up to you? I understand that if it's up to a client, they may have some preferences that you have to kind of acquiesce to, but I'm saying, like, for you, where do you begin that process?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I suppose the big difference is when it's for you, for oneself. And like those three mantles, 3 mantles, I suppose what I thought, because it was cathedral antiques, it would be nice to have something. It's my mantle at home, and I thought it'd be nice to have a picture that changes for each one. So that was the starting point, really, was that, and the pictures I have, not hanging above the mantle normally. And I thought, if I use that, just so that I could make it look interesting and different and have something to talk about, because what you and I were saying before this began, when there isn't an audience present, when you're not doing it live, you're a bit anxious that you don't get the reactions. So I thought, if I've got 3 quite different things, I'll please everybody. I'll be like an Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. There'll be a song that everybody likes. So
I love that.
I thought of the art for that first, and then what flowers would suit each thing, because I think that's the really important thing. The nerines wouldn't have looked nice in the first design, which was, for those of you who didn't see it, it was plants and old pots and tomatoes, and it was very weedy bits and pieces, and the nerines are almost too grand for that. Whereas on their own, they look incredibly, well, how they grow. You know, when you think of nerines, if you see nerines growing, they're usually along a wall or along a greenhouse where they get the sun. And the thing you notice is the very straight stems. They're not like tulips doing all that tumbly thing. They grow pretty straight, nerines. You very rarely get one with a sort of kink in the stem.
Right.
Lovely when you do. And so they suited that more angular, modern, with the modern painting. And then the last one was, I just thought I'll do something colorful, but I used amaryllis and crabapple and cyclamen flowers and begonia leaves, so that they added a bit of, because that's another thing. I always find that if I don't have some green in it, some foliage, some branches, as I think you often call them in America, I can't just do flowers on their own easily. I struggle with that. I mean, maybe a great big bowl of garden roses, but I like to find something. So the final one, the colorful one, I had to find something that was colorful, but was also foliage. And those massive begonia leaves did it for me. They looked, I wouldn't just add any foliage. I wouldn't sort of choose a bit of leatherleaf fern. It has to be something that is up to the task. And those big begonia leaves just, so that, I don't know if that explains the process. In that case, it started from the art and the desire to do 3 different things. If a client was involved in any of those 3 designs, I would have then, if they had shown me the first picture and said I wanted to be colorful, I would have struggled, because the first picture to me was green and natural and outside. So I would have had to find a way of making it colorful, but outside-ish. I might have used wildflowers, lots and lots of wildflowers. And if I'd been shown the second picture and been told I wanted to make it full of flowers, I'd have had to use one type of flower, but maybe I would have used something like white amaryllis with it. So there's always a way. It's yeah, I suppose it's like, again, like cooking. I always say that I think flowers have a great kinship with cooking. And if you want to make a pudding, you're not going to look at potatoes. That's the sort of, you have to get the right thing. You sort of think, what do I want it to be, chocolate or fruit? Do I want it to be very sweet, or do I want it to be like a sorbet? And you look at the right things for a pudding. And if you want a main course, you look at the right things for that. And I think flower people need to more think that way. It's not about your ego. It's about so many much more important things than your ego. I think that's the lesson that Constance Spry can teach, especially in her early stuff, where she was frankly much more involved than she was at the end, because 70 people, there wasn't a lot of Constance there. It was, I think things get a bit formulaic if it becomes a very big enterprise. But
I love that idea with a pudding or in cooking, that you may like 20 different things, but that doesn't mean they need to all go in that pot.
Doesn't. Yep.
And especially if some things are really strong that might overpower 3 other things, it doesn't allow them that moment to shine. And when I see your work, that really does make sense to me, because you allow each element really to shine. Oh, I mean, if it's not shining, perhaps like a foliage, it's a supporting actor or actress.
That's exactly it. Yes. They have to interact with each other in the right way. And a lot of that is by looking at how they grow together, and how you see them growing. And it isn't just about color, and also texture, all those things that you can only learn by looking at other things. And subconsciously, you remember a lot more than you think. You don't have to. I teach a group of Koreans sometimes, and they write everything down and they make notes and they draw pictures, and it doesn't necessarily produce the best result, I have to say. Sometimes if you allow your gut instinct to tell you what to do, it remembers some of the things you've seen. So you need to expose that gut instinct to lots of good influences.
Yes.
And then you're quite right. Everything, there should be a few star performers, but there should be, nothing should be looking like it's just there to fill a space. Because that's not good design of any description. And it is what a lot of people use foliage for. And that's a shame. You know, they buy the cheapest thing they can have just to have green in it.
Or to hide mechanics, like
foam. To hide mechanics,
like
yes.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the F word, oh dear.
Yeah, I know, sorry. I digress.
Yeah.
Often when we are concluding these episodes, I always like to ask for a piece of advice from my guest. And in this case, since you're such a learned student of Miss Spry, I wonder, what do you think she would give as a piece of advice?
Heavens. But she always said, sort of, dare to follow your own star, and dare to be individual, and dare to be different. And there's a quote which you quite often see where, where she says, if you want to be fancy, be fancy. If you want to be plain, be plain. If you want, and I think it is that people do think that flowers have to be formulaic. They don't. Dare to be individual, and dare and look at people whose work is totally different from your work, and just see why it's different, and what is it you like about it, what is it you don't like about it. I mean, some incredible artists in the world of flowers, and I get great inspiration looking at how they do things, and it is just dare to be different. And look at nature. Always, always, always. She might not have said that because in those days it was perhaps more obvious, and people who did flowers quite often had a garden. I think, if you've got a windowsill in the middle of Manhattan and you want to do flowers, grow 3 bulbs on it. Watch how they grow. Sow some seed, watch how that grows. Even if you have to plant it in, a curbside in the middle of the city or something afterwards, just see how things grow, and then dare to be different, dare to take that as your inspiration, is what I would say.
I love that. I love how you framed that, because I feel like so many times we don't give people the permission to be themselves, or to add their own 2 cents or their own creative twist to what they learn and see and do. So
and a lot of that is the problem of social media, and also event planners who show the client ideas before they involve the flower designer, florist. So there's a lot of re-education to come along, and I think people should have the confidence to say, I don't think this is the right job for me. If someone is, if they feel the client and they will not get along, it's much better to say, I really don't think this is going to work. The hardest, I've only done it about twice in my whole 30-year career, but it's better to do that than to do something you really are ashamed of.
Right, because it's always, in that situation, my fear would be that if everybody loves it for whatever reason, then perhaps the person whose idea it was gets the credit. But if it's a disaster, then it's probably your head on the chopping block.
Totally.
And so then it is better to say to be true to yourself. And I know a lot of times that's a confidence issue for people. They feel like we've got to do things. But I also like, some things you hinted at earlier, where sometimes it's possible for you to have a conversation and perhaps find a compromise. And whether it was white amaryllis with that one particular mantelpiece, or how to introduce color maybe in foliages or things like that. So anyway, I appreciate that. And hopefully, I feel really strongly that Constance is looking down on this conversation, and she is quite happy that we are discipling her cause and helping to spread this word and empowering people, just like she did, to embrace.
That's what she did. Yeah. I mean, it's much more than photographs of flowers with Constance Spry, and I think that's the lesson we can all take away. We don't have to be just photographs of flowers. We can make a lot of change, and we can empower people. And her whole approach was instinctively sustainable and seasonal. And I think that's, you know, for today, she wouldn't have known what sustainability was. Couldn't have spelt it probably. But I think that's the other real help for today. Look at what she wrote about. She wrote one book called Summer and Autumn Flowers and another book called Spring and Winter Flowers. They're utter gems for any grower out there, any florist, any person who wants to grow for their own house even. Those two books are brilliant.
I love that. I so love that. Well, Shane, thank you so much for this
pleasure
time.
As always, Scott.
I have learned so much, and I have been so inspired, and I definitely am going to have to work on my book list a little bit for this year and add a little more Constance to it. So
a little more Constance in your book, a little more Constance in your life.
There you go.
That'd be good.
All right. Thank you so much, Shane.
Pleasure. Lovely to see you again. Bye-bye.